Good afternoon. My name is Keith Daniels, and this is my presentation for ACR301 Assessment 3. The topic of discussion is firearm regulation. Issues and concerns. Free or loosely regulated firearm ownership has not shown to have direct correlation to gun crime or firearm-related injuries. Now on slide 7 of this presentation, you'll find two infographics from a CNN article on gun ownership and its relation to gun-related homicides. And it demonstrates that while Switzerland has a rate of firearm ownership half per capita that of the United States, it does not have half the gun crime. It's not even in the top 10 of gun crime compared to the United States, which is number 1. Now this is important because it demonstrates that there is no direct correlation between the two, as in there has to be other factors involved that must be considered, not simply the ownership of firearms by private citizens. Comparative firearm regulations do not always produce similar results in these forms of crime, and this raises the question of what other factors can or should be considered as related to gun crime and gun-related injuries or violence, such as mental health. Now, when it comes to the United States, mental health is a very important issue because unlike countries like, again, Switzerland or Australia or the United Kingdom, they don't have a form of universal health care that can cover the cost of mental health services for less than fortunate individuals. And I personally believe, and there is studies to support at least the possibility of this being a factor in the propensity for mass shootings, besides the easy access to firearms. Firearm regulation also demonstrates the issue of ideological standpoints when drawing comparisons between nations and their government stance on firearms, such as the ideological and legal protection of firearm ownership in the United States. While the United States is the only country on the planet where the right to own firearms for private citizens is protected under the law, it's not the only country where there is a sentiment towards this. Now, the article I've provided a link to from Blake describes a situation where a very old and outdated section in old Canadian law has been subverted by pro-gun activists as a means to attempt to institute their own form of the Second Amendment protection to firearms. Current responses. Two forms of firearm regulation responses are firearm bans and firearm registration. Now, these are not mutually exclusive. They can operate independently of each other, and they can also be enforced alongside one another. Firearm bans, such as the ban on semi-automatic and automatic firearms enacted by the Howard government, makes ownership or possession of a certain kind of firearm a criminal offence. The firearm bans instituted by the Howard government are an example where the registration and bans were instituted simultaneously, where the ban on automatic and semi-automatic weapons went into effect, but there was exceptions for other forms of firearm, including some semi-automatic firearms, in the cases where an individual was willing to register them with the government. Firearm registration is the enactment and enforcement of a legally mandatory requirement for all firearm owners to have any and all weapons they own be registered in a government or police database. Again, referencing back to the reaction to the Port Arthur massacre by the Howard government, registration was offered as an alternative for some firearm owners in exchange for the continued possession of their weapons that they had purchased. They could have them registered with the government. However, these did not apply to automatic weapons, which were subject to an outright blanket ban and were ordered to be handed in or otherwise considered illegal objects. Pros and cons. Firearm bans. The pros: visibility of action and politically popular, and large-scale removal of firearms. The highly visible and politically popular nature of firearm bans, particularly in almost every country apart from the United States, where there is an anti-gun sentiment among the majority of the population, makes them incredibly popular to anyone who's looking for an easy target in terms of political point scoring. And also with the large-scale removal of firearms, it's an easy way to criminalise not only the ownership of a certain kind of firearms, such as automatic weapons or semi-automatic weapons in Australia, but it's also a way to just remove a large number of these from the population, which means they're less likely to be stolen or used for illicit purposes. Cons: not shown to affect crime rates, primarily targets law-abiding gun owners. Now this is quite self-explanatory really. If you confiscate all the firearms, a vast majority of individuals will not be committing crimes with their own legally purchased and legally obtained firearms. And there is no demonstrable evidence that this has affected the violent crime rate. However, as a caveat, I will note that there has been a change in the form of violent crime in terms of assaults and burglaries and armed robberies. It's no longer the use of a firearm in a majority of cases, as it may otherwise be. Registration. Pros: easier to identify firearms used in criminal acts, monitoring of firearm numbers nationally. This again is quite self-explanatory. If you have a running registry of all the firearms in the country and who owns them, it's easy to at least gain tangential evidence about the firearm used in a particular crime, even if it was stolen. And monitoring of firearm numbers nationally is an important number to keep track of, particularly when you're trying to address the issue of black market or grey market firearms within the country. Cons: inaccurate data can result in wrongful police action, not effective in preventing stolen firearms from being used in crime. Now, there was an incident in the last few years where the Victoria Police instituted a large-scale raid on a security firm in Melbourne because firearm registry data had indicated that they had a number of guns that were still marked as seized by police. Now, unfortunately, this particular firm had purchased these firearms in a police buyback program from Victoria Police, legally and all above board, and it's resulted in a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against Victoria Police. As to the second point, it's again quite self-explanatory. It's not effective in stopping people from using firearms, particularly if they steal a firearm from another individual. It only provides tangential information about who might be engaging in illegal activity with a stolen firearm. This tangential information obviously applies to things like when it was stolen, where it was stolen from, and the particular kind of weapon that was stolen from that individual. Future directions. The United States should institute a more rigorous mental health system and strengthen the federal background check system they already have in place. There is an argument to be made that if the United States had a more robust and rigorous mental health system, particularly for young people, it would serve in some capacity to curtail the number of mass shootings and illegal firearm use by young people in the United States as a result of untreated or unrecognized mental health symptoms. Strengthening the federal background check system and applying more strict enforcement and strict penalties for failure to comply with the federal background check system would go a long way to avert incidents of individuals wrongly obtaining firearms through illegal means. Australia should provide more freedom for firearm owners to use their firearms in self-defense in order to prevent hot burglaries, domestic violence, and other violent crimes primarily impacting defenseless individuals, as well as overhaul or remove the ineffective firearm registration system to prevent illegal police actions as a result of flawed intelligence. There is an argument to be made that the use of a firearm as a deterrent or as a means of protecting oneself would be extremely useful for individuals who are not physically capable of protecting themselves from a violent criminal, such as the elderly, women, and those with disabilities. The current accepted standard of minimum necessary force does not really account for situations where an unarmed individual has a significant physical advantage over another unarmed individual. And I believe that there is an issue here that needs to be resolved so that individuals who are not physically capable of engaging in physical combat with an assailant can still adequately protect themselves and live without fear of being burgled or having their home invaded. Overhauling or addressing the issues with the firearm registration system is evidently required due to the issues that it causes and the millions of dollars in taxpayer money that will be spent defending the actions of state police and federal police forces as a result of flawed intelligence. Self-reflection. I've learned some of the issues that come with enforcing firearm restrictions in countries with less fluid constitutional values than Australia, i.e. the US Second Amendment. While I have a personal interest in the firearm debate that goes on throughout the United States and the rest of the world, before I began researching in this assignment, I was not aware to the extent to which the United States had the protection under the Second Amendment. And I now have a far better understanding of just how difficult it would be to enforce Australian-style gun control measures in the United States due to their inflexible constitutional protection of firearm ownership. I've learned that legal firearm ownership is not directly linked to gun crime and that instituting firearm regulation on law-abiding citizens is rarely effective. During my studies in this unit, I haven't found any significant evidence to suggest that individuals who legally own firearms use those legally owned firearms to commit illegal acts. And I don't see the effectiveness, and I haven't found any evidence to suggest there is an effectiveness in instituting firearm restrictions on law-abiding citizens. I've learned the value of gun buybacks of a voluntary nature as a means of removing unwanted firearms and the beneficial effects it can have on a community when enacted voluntarily. Again, building off my previous point, I believe that voluntary gun buybacks and a voluntary system of surrendering firearms is extremely beneficial, provided again, of course, that it is voluntary. And I believe that individuals who would surrender their firearms voluntarily are individuals who would also most likely be victims of firearm theft due to their general disinterest in the maintenance and protection of their own firearms. Here are the infographics mentioned in slide 2 pertaining to Switzerland versus the United States in terms of firearm ownership and firearm related homicides. Now, as you can see on the left, the United States owns 89 guns per 100 people on average, whereas Switzerland owns roughly half of that with 46 guns per 100 people on average. Now, if you look to the right on the second infographic, it states that in the United States, it's 66 per 1 million people will die unintentionally or through suicide or undetermined means with a firearm, and there'll be 36 firearm-related homicides per 1 million people. And on that chart, you cannot find Switzerland, despite them having half the firearm ownership.